Hello and welcome from my side to the year 2023. I hope you already had a great start into the year. Last year I was testing quite some lenses and cameras such as the R7 and the R3, and this made me think, what can we expect from Canon this year, or what do I wish for? So I've been using the Canon EOS R5 as my main camera for wildlife and nature photography in general for the last 2.5 or a bit more than 2.5 years. If you would have asked me half a year ago about a potential successor, I would have said not before 2024. But now that we have the Canon EOS R6 Mark II, I think that in 2023 we can also expect the R5 Mark II. So what do I wish from this camera? Well, first of all, I would like if the sensor stays more or less around the 45 megapixel that we have now. For me, that's enough for cropping if I need to frame the image a bit tighter, and still the images are not too large as they get really heavy in post-production, or then signal to noise ratio gets worse. So that's for me a nice compromise. I also don't expect to see a stacked sensor in this camera. I think this will be reserved for the R3 and R5. But if the readout speed can just be improved a tiny bit more, I think it's fine for 99.5% of the cases, at least when I shoot wildlife. And pretty much the same goes with the 20 frames per second. This is for me basically fast enough. But now that the R6 Mark II shoots up to 40 frames per second, I think we can also expect a slight increase here at the R5. And for me here, 30 frames per second would be enough. Just give us the option to dial it back if we want to. And what would be also important for me is that the buffer size stays the same or gets increased a bit. We will see, because with 30 frames per second it obviously feels faster. And to avoid buffer issues, please give us 2 CF Express card slots. In these situations where you know this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, I would really like to shoot redundant, and this is not possible with a CF Express and an SD card slot, just because it slows the whole workflow too much down for me. So I hope this will be an improvement. And what should also be improved in terms of speed is the viewfinder. Overall, I like the viewfinder. It's quite big, it has a nice resolution. For me, also the colors are quite fine. But you do have some kind of blackout in the shooting. Again, for me it's not terrible, but if you compare it to the R3, with the R3 it's really easier to track at least erratically moving or erratically flying birds, and I would wish for an improvement here on the R5 Mark II as well. Otherwise, there's really not so much that I don't like about the camera. Some hardware things, like I would really love if they would make a full-sized HDMI. This just makes the recording for my YouTube videos a bit easier. And then I would love if they bring back the GPS that they had in the 5D Mark IV, also back in an R5 Mark II. Otherwise, I think we can also expect to have the pre-burst, the pre-shooting, like we have on the R7 and R6 Mark II. And also some other nice features like the optical viewfinder simulations that I like to use sometimes in backlit situations, or the automatic leveling of the sensor. Already when Canon released the EOS R3, they told us it's not their flagship model. So this meant that there would be an EOS R1, and I think 2023 is the year we are going to see this camera announced. So what should it be? I think it should be some kind of a hybrid of the R5 and the R3, or the best of the R5 and R3, plus a bit more. So let me explain. The R3 has the clearly more professional body. I think it will use this body, the bigger viewfinder of the R3, maybe even bigger or higher resolution, we will see. It has a stacked sensor of the R3, but where the R5 is, at least for some people, better, is in terms of resolution, where it just offers these 45 megapixels versus 24 on the R3. I think that 24 of the R3 are probably fine for many people. For photojournalists or sport photographers, maybe this is even better. But as an all-around camera, if you also do some landscape photography, or maybe you need to crop a tiny bit more, sometimes with birds, or you print big, I like to have a bit more than 24. So I would assume that, or I would hope that the R1 has like something in the 45 megapixel area, maybe a bit less noise than the R5, We will see. And I really hope it will not be an 80 megapixel sensor, just because the file sizes gets huge. Everything will be a bit slowed down, and I'm sometimes questioning in wildlife, where you have so many other things that can go wrong, where is the limit of what is actually still useful? One big weakness of the R3 when we look to the competitors is, in my opinion, also the card slots again. So here I think it's a must that they put two CF Express card slots, and also the HDMI and the GPS that I already mentioned for the R5 Mark II. Canon already introduced this like super short burst of up to 190 frames per second with the R3. So I would just expect that with the R1, maybe 40 frames per second is like the new standard high continuous shooting mode. And of course, I also expect that we see pre-burst and maybe a bit more sophisticated pre-burst. Maybe can be longer than 1 second, maybe 1.5 seconds, or we will see. But I hope that there is also some kind of improvement there. The autofocus on the R5 is already very good, on the R3 even a tiny bit better. So if the R1 just continues the trend, this is cool. Just one thing, sometimes I have problem with the mirrorless cameras, that they are kind of stuck on the background and cannot focus on something close, especially if it's small. So any kind of workaround would be cool here. I hope that this quad pixel autofocus might help, where each pixel is divided into 4 subpixels instead of just 2 on the current Canon mirrorless cameras. This would be amazing. We will see if it's happening. So I mentioned with the R5 Mark II and the R1, I would actually hope for not having more megapixels than these 45. But some people want this. Studio photographers doing like advertisements, commercials, and landscape photographers. So I would hope that for them Canon kind of splits the R5 series like they did with the 5D series, meaning that they would introduce an R5S that would come with 60, 70 or 75 megapixels, but maybe it can be a bit slower. I mean, probably if you do this type of high resolution shooting, you would be fine with just 10 or 12 frames per second. You don't need 30. So personally, I would prefer this split here. The fourth and last camera I would like to see in 2023 being released from Canon would be a successor of the original EOS R, the first R series camera. And I would think that they would switch away from the naming. Maybe it will be called an R8 or an R9, we will see. Basically, I would just hope an updated version, like a new sensor, still full frame obviously, putting the animal eye detection autofocus of an R6 Mark II or whatever inside, give it a joystick, so maybe just recycle the R6 Mark II or R7 body, we will see. It doesn't need to be the fastest. If it has a bit of rolling shutter, that's probably tolerable as well, but just a nice entry-level all-around full-frame camera that doesn't break your bank account. So let's move to the lenses, which in my opinion are more important than cameras. Canon has decided to, at least for now, not open the RF mount to third-party manufacturers. I'm kind of okay with this. I prefer Canon glass, but this also means that Canon needs to deliver and bring enough options for us. And here are some things where I think Canon still, the lineup is not complete yet. So last year they announced the 100mm macro lens. I could only play with it for a really short time, but it seems to be a quite cool lens. But the problem is it's 100mm, and if I take pictures of butterflies, dragonflies, toads, other amphibians, whatever, for wildlife, macro wildlife, it's a bit short. I still use my 150mm Sigma lens, and I would wish for something similar from Canon, 150 to 180mm macro lens. So why not just keep using the Sigma lens? Well, obviously I will do this for now, but there are 2 problems. The first one, you cannot get this lens anymore. So I'm lucky enough to have one, I'm quite happy with it, but if you want to start taking pictures of dragonflies or again damselflies, butterflies, whatever, and you want to buy this Sigma, you kind of need to buy it used. The second point is just that the autofocus is a bit erratic, it's not so good. The image stabilization is really bad, always has been, but since I have the 100 to 500, it's kind of depressing if you compare the RF 100 to 500 and the Sigma 150mm 2.8. I still love it when working from a tripod and I really have my time, but the 100 to 500 is so much more flexible, so these kind of combined, so just a 100mm macro like Canon introduced with more focal length would be a dream. The next thing that I think is just missing is a 300mm 2.8. I'm not sure if I would buy one, probably not, but I think this just needs to be in the lineup. And the last version was the EF version 2, so I think this is overdue. Another one that is kind of missing is a 500mm f4. But I don't think that's so important anymore, since the weight of the 600mm f4 and 400mm 2.8 has come down quite a bit. So, I mean, this was for many people, I think, the reason to go for a 500mm f4 instead of the 600mm f4, just because of the really heavy weight of the 600mm. So now I would kind of wish they would go one step more and reduce weight more by maybe making it a 500mm 4.5 or 500mm f5 DO lens. Because it seems like Nikon, I mean, they have a lot of options now with the 400mm f4.5 and the 800mm 6.3. These still super tele lenses, which still have a quite wide open aperture, but just, yeah, a bit of compromise for having lighter weight. And I think this would be amazing if Canon could bring something like this in a new 500mm lens. One last lens that comes to my mind is a 200 to 600mm f5 to 6.3. Why do we need this lens if we already have the 100 to 500? Well, the problem for me is that the 100 to 500 is a bit similar than the 100 to 400 from Sony, for example. So it's a really nice and compact lens, not too heavy, super sharp, good autofocus, amazing image stabilization, but it's quite expensive. And this is the perfect companion for me with my 600mm f4. But if you just want one bit longer lens that is not too expensive, Sony has a way better offer with the 200 to 600mm. And I really hope Canon would also build something like this. It can be a bit heavier than the 100 to 500, doesn't need to be that good in image quality. If autofocus and image stabilization are slightly worse, I think that's also tolerable, but something that just sits like kind of in between the excellent but quite dark and short 100 to 400mm and the also excellent but quite expensive 100 to 500mm. That's it for today. Of course, Canon will not listen to my wish list or anything. I just sometimes think it's a bit a funny thought experiment, what could be released, what I still wish for. Let me know what you would like to see from Canon or other manufacturers in this year, and I wish you a nice day.